A lonely woman buys a too wild giant cowboy. And the first words he whispers are something only her husband ever said. The dusty street falls silent. A church bell tolls in the cold night air. Folks say he's dangerous, untamable. But why does he know her dead husband's private promise? She takes him in, thinking it's just for the winter. But in this town, water is power, and her land is in the crosshairs. Soon the creek runs thin, enemies close in, and the only man who might save her is locked in the jailhouse. Storms are rising, on the land, and in her heart. What hidden vow binds them together? And will it be enough to save everything she loves before it's washed away? Before we begin, drop a hello in the comments. Share your corner of the world and how you're feeling today. It's a beautiful thing to witness how stories can connect us across oceans, languages, and lives. The cold bit deep into Clara's bones as she stood beneath the flickering lamplight outside the town hall. Her fingers trembled, partly from the winter chill and partly from the weight of what she'd just done. The leather-bound contract in her hand felt as heavy as a millstone. The crowd filtered out of the building behind her, their whispers sharp as icicles. Clara kept her chin high, though her heart hammered against her ribs. She'd spent nearly every penny she had, plus promised part of her deed as collateral, all to buy the contract of a man she barely knew. Jonas Grey Wolf towered beside her, his wrists still bound in iron cuffs. In the yellow glow of the lamp, his face remained calm, showing neither triumph nor shame at being sold like cattle. His quiet dignity made the whole affair seem even more wrong. "Let's get those off you," Clara said, fishing the key from the bailiff's envelope. The metal clinked as she worked the lock, trying to steady her hands. The cuffs fell away. Jonas rubbed his wrists, his movements deliberate and careful, like everything else about him. Up close, Clara could see the wells of patience in his dark eyes, so different from the wild savage Ephraim Cole had tried to paint him as during the bidding. "Much obliged," Jonas said softly. His voice carried the same gentle strength she remembered from their few encounters at her store. The town hall door banged open. Ephraim Cole stormed out, his expensive boots clicking against the wooden walkway. He stopped short when he saw them, his face twisting into something ugly. "You've made a grave mistake, Mrs. Harrow," Cole said, adjusting his silk tie. "That contract's worth more than your whole store. The syndicate would have put him to proper use." Clara lifted her chin higher. "My money, my choice, Mr. Cole. The law's clear on that." "The law?" Cole laughed, but there was no warmth in it. "We'll see what the law has to say about a widow taking on such a dangerous element." He spat the words like poison. Before Clara could respond, Jonas stepped forward. Not threatening, just present. His shadow fell across Cole, who took an involuntary step back. "The lady bought my contract fair," Jonas said quietly. "I aim to honor it." Cole's face reddened. He opened his mouth, then thought better of it. With a final glare at Clara, he turned and stalked away into the darkness. Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The night air frosted it white before her face. She turned to Jonas, meaning to thank him for his support, but the words caught in her throat when he leaned close. "I'll keep the wolves far while your coffee stays hot," he whispered. Clara's world tilted. Those words. Her Thomas's words. The private promise he'd made every morning before heading out to work the ranch. No one else had ever heard it. She staggered back, grabbing the lamppost for support. "How ... Her voice cracked. "How do you know those words?" Jonas's eyes held a deep sadness. "3 winters back, bad blizzard caught me in the high country. Your husband found me, got me to shelter. Saved my life that night." Clara remembered that storm. Thomas had come home late, soaked to the bone, but wouldn't say where he'd been. "Before the fever took him," Jonas continued softly. "He made me promise. Said to look after you if anything happened. I'm sorry I couldn't bring his message sooner." Tears pricked at Clara's eyes, but she blinked them back. The grief was old now, but hearing Thomas's words again opened wounds she thought had healed. "Why didn't you tell me before?" she asked. "Wasn't sure you'd believe me. Figured actions speak louder than words." Jonas glanced at the contract in her hands. "Reckon now I can keep that promise proper." Clara studied him in the lamplight. The strength in his stance, the quiet honor in his eyes. She could see why Thomas had trusted him. Her late husband had always been a good judge of character. "Well then," she said, straightening her shoulders, "we've got work to do come morning. The store needs restocking, and the north fence won't fix itself." Jonas nodded, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Yes, ma'am. I know the way." They walked in comfortable silence through the sleeping town, their footsteps crunching on the frozen ground. The winter wind howled like wolves in the distance, but Clara felt warmer than she had in months. Thomas's last message had finally reached her, carried by the most unlikely messenger. Tomorrow would bring its own troubles. Cole wouldn't give up easily, and the town gossips would have plenty to say about her decision. But for now, Clara held tight to her husband's words, wrapped in the promise of coffee and safety, of wolves kept far at bay. The snow drifted like cotton wisps as Clara and Jonas made their way down Main Street. Lamplight from shop windows cast long shadows across the freshly fallen white, their boots leaving paired tracks in the pristine covering. The general store's wooden sign creaked in the winter wind, the words Harrow's Mercantile still visible despite the weathered paint. Clara fumbled with her keys, her fingers stiff from cold. "I've got a line shack out on the homestead," she said, working the lock. "It's basic but sound. You're welcome to it?" Jonas nodded once. "That'll do fine." Inside, the store smelled of coffee beans, leather, and wool. Clara moved straight to the pot-bellied stove in the corner, opening its iron door with practiced ease. The embers inside glowed weakly. She added kindling and a few chunks of coal, then worked the bellows until warmth began spreading through the room. "Have a seat," she said, gesturing to one of the wooden chairs by the stove. "Coffee won't take but a minute." Jonas settled into the chair, his large frame making it seem small. He removed his hat, revealing dark hair touched with early silver at the temples. Clara busied herself with the coffee pot, measuring grounds into the beaten tin container. "Met your husband 2 winters back," Jonas said quietly as she worked. "Near the reservation line. My horse had gone lame, weather turning bad. He stopped to help, shared his coffee and jerky." A pause. "Good man." Clara's hands stilled on the coffee pot. "Yes," she said softly. "He was." The coffee began to percolate, filling the store with its rich aroma. Clara pulled up another chair, leaving space between them. The stove's heat pushed back the chill, but couldn't quite reach the corners where shadows gathered. "Store's been struggling," she admitted, pouring 2 cups. "Supply wagons keep running late. Every delay puts me deeper in debt to the bank." She handed him a cup. "The drought hasn't helped. Fewer folks buying extras these days." Jonas wrapped his hands around the warm tin cup. "Noticed the creeks running low when I passed through last month. Not right for this time of year." They sat in comfortable silence, sipping coffee and watching snow fall beyond the store's front window. When the eastern sky began to lighten, Clara stood and gathered her heavy wool coat. "Best we head out to the homestead," she said. "You'll want to get settled before full light." They rode out as dawn broke, their horses' hooves crunching through fresh snow. The town fell away behind them, replaced by open range and scattered pine. A mile out, Clara turned down a narrow track, leading them past a broken gatepost bearing the Harrow brand. The line shack stood against a backdrop of winter-bare cottonwoods, its log walls silver with age. A thin creek whispered past, its banks crusted with ice. Jonas dismounted, studying the water with narrowed eyes. "Creek's lower than it should be," he said, crouching to examine the flow. "Something's changed upstream. The syndicate's been digging irrigation ditches on their new holdings." Clara said. Could that affect it? Might. Jonas straightened, brushing snow from his knees. I'll check the fence line today, see what I can spot. The shack's interior was plain but solid, a narrow bed, wood stove, rough table and chair. Clara had stocked it with basic supplies the day before: coffee, beans, flour, salt pork. Jonas set his saddle by the door and nodded approval. This'll do just fine, he said again. Much obliged. I'll leave you to settle in, Clara said. Store opens at 8 o'clock. Stop by if you need anything. Back in town, Clara unlocked the store and lit the lamps. The morning passed in a blur of customers and calculations. When the last patron left, she pulled out her leather-bound ledger and opened to a fresh page. Her pen scratched across the paper. December 15th, 1879. Hired J. Gray Wolfe for winter season. Contract paid in full plus promissory note against deed. She paused, then added, Thomas trusted him. Perhaps that's enough. That evening, Clara sat at her bedroom window, watching snow pile on the sill. Her mind kept returning to Jonas's whispered words outside the town hall. Thomas's private promise, carried all these years by a stranger. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass, remembering. A mile away, Jonas added wood to the line shack's stove. The creek's weak voice drew him to the door. He stood there long moments, watching the sluggish water catch starlight. Something was wrong with its flow, and that meant trouble coming. He'd seen it before, how water rights could turn neighbor against neighbor faster than any other cause. The creek whispered on, too thin for comfort, while snow continued falling in the darkness. Morning brought a thick blanket of frost to Harrow's Crossing. Ice crystals painted delicate patterns across the line shack's windows, glinting like scattered diamonds in the pale winter sun. Jonas Gray Wolfe's breath fogged the air as he made his way to the weathered barn, his boots crunching through fresh snow. The barn's heavy door groaned on its hinges. Inside he found Clara's late husband's tools hanging in neat rows, familiar shapes that spoke of care and order. Jonas selected what he needed: hammer, saw, pliers, and a coil of wire. The wooden handles were smooth from years of use, telling stories of mended fences and patched roofs. He had just started work on a broken fence section when hoofbeats approached through the morning stillness. Clara rode up on her bay mare, a basket secured to her saddle horn. The horse's flanks steamed in the cold air. "Brought you some provisions," she called, dismounting with practiced ease. Fresh bread, cheese, and hot coffee in the pot. Jonas drove one last nail home before setting down his hammer. Much obliged. They settled on upturned buckets near the fence line, the basket between them. The coffee steam rose in thin spirals, carrying warmth against the morning chill. Clara broke the bread, still warm from her oven, and passed him a generous piece. "Creek's running slower than I remember," she said, watching the thin stream of water threading through ice-rimmed banks. Past winters it never dropped this low, even in the coldest months. Jonas nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Mind if I follow it upstream a ways? Something's not sitting right." "I'll ride with you," Clara said, wrapping the remaining bread in a cloth. "I know these waters well as anyone." They mounted up and followed the creek's winding path, hooves breaking through patches of crusty snow. The water grew no stronger as they rode, staying thin and sluggish. After about 2 miles, Jonas reined in sharply. "There," he said, pointing to a crude earthen wall that cut across the natural flow. "That's your trouble." They dismounted for a closer look. The berm was rough but effective, redirecting most of the creek's flow toward railroad lands to the east. Clara's gloved hands clenched at her sides. "This wasn't here 3 months ago," she said, voice tight with anger. "Who would dare?" "Fresh dirt," Jonas observed, crouching to examine the construction. "Can't be more than a few weeks old, built quick and quiet-like." The wind picked up, carrying ice crystals that stung their faces. Clara pulled her coat tighter, her expression troubled. "We should head back. I need to ask some questions in town." The ride back was silent, both lost in thought about what they'd found. In town that afternoon, Clara made her rounds, speaking with older ranchers who'd worked the land for decades. Their responses painted a disturbing picture. Cattle syndicate's been playing water games all up and down the territory, old Jim Wheeler told her, spitting tobacco juice into a tin can. Diverting here, damming there, acting like they own every drop. Others shared similar stories, small creeks going dry, mysterious changes to water flow, complaints ignored by authorities. Each tale added weight to Clara's worry. She was examining her ledger when Deputy Wade Flanders pushed through the store's door, bringing a gust of cold air with him. His badge caught the lamplight as he approached the counter. "Mrs. Harrow," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Word is you're asking questions about water rights." Clara met his gaze steadily. "I'm concerned about changes to the creek flow on my property." "Best leave such matters to proper authorities," Flanders advised, his tone carrying an edge of warning. "And I'd think twice about poking around with that wild hand you hired. Some folks are mighty uncomfortable with him being here. Jonas Greywolf is my employee, Deputy. His character isn't your concern." Flanders adjusted his gun belt, a gesture meant to remind her of his authority. "Just passing along friendly advice, ma'am. Good day to you." The deputy had barely left when Jonas entered, ignoring the hostile stares from other customers. He placed a handful of items on the counter, nails, seed packets, and a new saw blade. "Found what I needed," he said quietly. Clara tallied his purchases, noting how the other patrons gave him a wide berth. "Stop by the line shack this evening," she said as she wrapped the items. "We should talk." That night, the little shack was warm and bright against the darkness. A pot of stew bubbled on the wood stove, filling the air with savory steam. Clara sat at the rough table while Jonas stirred the pot. "Thomas loved this land," she said, accepting a bowl of stew. "He knew every draw and hollow, every spring and seep. Said we were stewards, not owners." Jonas nodded, settling across from her with his own bowl. "Good way of thinking. Water's life out here. Needs protecting." "The syndicate doesn't see it that way. They're treating it like a commodity to be bought and sold." Clara wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "What they're doing isn't right." "No," Jonas agreed. "It ain't right at all." They talked late into the evening, sharing memories of Thomas Harrow and his vision for the land. When Clara finally rode home, the stars were bright and cold in the winter sky. In her bedroom, she knelt beside her bed, praying for guidance in the troubles ahead. Back at the line shack, Jonas worked by lamplight, mending a broken gate he'd brought in from the fence line. The creek's weak voice drifted through the night, a constant reminder of the wrong that needed righting. His hands moved steadily with the tools, but his mind turned over possibilities, weighing choices and consequences in the quiet hours before dawn. The sound of running water, thin and wrong, whispered on through the darkness. By Wednesday morning, frost gave way to weak sunshine as Jonas worked steadily on the corral. The old posts creaked as he tested each one, marking those that needed replacing. His breath clouded in the cold air while he worked, methodically moving from section to section. Later that afternoon, he turned his attention to the sagging portion of the acequia, the traditional irrigation ditch that served the community. Ice had built up along its banks, and debris choked the narrow channel. Jonas worked carefully, breaking up the ice with a long pole and clearing away dead branches. As he cleared a particularly dense patch of ice near an old stone abutment, something caught his eye. Brushing away years of accumulated grime, Jonas revealed careful chisel marks in the stone. His calloused fingers traced the weathered initials, S.C. Below the letters, a date had been carved, 1852. Jonas straightened, understanding the significance. This was more than just a marker, it was proof. He gathered his tools and headed toward Clara's store, the discovery weighing on his mind. Clara was tallying inventory when Jonas entered, bringing a gust of cold air with him. "Found something you need to see." he said quietly. They rode out together, the horses' hooves crunching through patches of snow. At the acequia, Jonas showed her the carved stone. Clara knelt beside it, running her fingers over the initials. See, she murmured. Silas Cobb, the deacon. He's lived here longer than anyone. She stood, brushing dirt from her skirts. We need to talk to him. They found Deacon Cobb in his small house near the church, warming his old bones by the fire. His white hair caught the firelight as he examined the sketch Jonas had made of the carved stone. Lord above, the old man said, voice rough with memory. Haven't thought about those marks in years. Was my first real job here, managing the acequia records. He looked up at Clara and Jonas. That ditch ran strong and true, fed every farm and ranch for 20 miles, until the railroad came through. We need those records, Deacon, Clara said. The syndicate's diverting water upstream. Silas nodded slowly. Reckon I might have some old papers in my trunk. Water rights from territorial days. He fixed them with a sharp look. You aiming to make trouble? Aiming to make things right, Jonas replied quietly. Clara spent that evening planning, her ledger open before her. The next morning, she rode from farm to farm, extending invitations to a work frolic, a community gathering to clear the acequia before spring thaw. Bring your shovels, she told each neighbor, and your appetites. We'll make a proper day of it. Saturday dawned clear and cold. By mid-morning, wagons and riders converged on the Harrow property. Women set up tables near the line shack, laying out pies and bread. Men gathered with shovels and picks, while children darted about, eager to help. Clara felt her heart lift at the turnout. Even those who'd been cool toward her lately had come, drawn by the promise of community and purpose. The smell of coffee and baked goods filled the air, mixing with the sharp scent of winter. A quiet murmur spread through the crowd as Naicha Yazi arrived on his painted horse. The Apache elder dismounted with dignity, nodding to those nearby. He made his way to where Jonas stood examining the ditch line. My father's father helped build these waterways, Naicha said, his voice carrying the weight of generations. There is a proper way to grade them, so the water flows true. Jonas listened intently as Naicha explained the traditional methods of ditch construction, how to angle the banks, where to place stones to prevent erosion. Others gathered around, drawn by the elder's quiet authority and deep knowledge. The water is like blood in the earth's veins, Naicha told them. It must flow freely to give life. The work proceeded steadily through the day. Men shoveled while women kept the coffee hot and the food coming. Children formed bucket brigades to haul away brush and small stones. The sound of working songs and laughter filled the air. Clara moved among the workers, offering encouragement and thanks. She noticed how people who normally kept their distance from Jonas now worked alongside him, following his lead as he implemented Naicha's guidance. The old prejudices seemed to fade in the face of shared purpose. By late afternoon, the first section of the acequia ran clear. The sound of water trickling over clean stone brought smiles to tired faces. Workers paused to listen, understanding the promise in that simple sound. As dusk approached, Clara called everyone to gather near the line shack. Steam rose from cups of hot coffee as people stamped their feet against the cold. I want to thank you all, she said, her voice carrying across the yard. Today we've done more than clear a ditch. We've remembered what it means to be neighbors. She paused, looking at the faces around her. Weather-worn ranchers, capable farm wives, curious children, and Jonas standing quietly at the edge of the crowd. This is how we'll keep our water flowing true, together. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathering. Clara felt a swell of hope in her chest, unfamiliar but welcome. For the first time since Thomas died, she felt truly part of something larger than herself. As people began loading wagons and heading home, Naicha approached Jonas. The two men stood in comfortable silence, watching the last light fade from the sky. Finally, Naicha spoke. You understand the old ways, he said, yet you work with the new. This is good. He gestured toward the acequia. "Water knows no boundaries. Neither should we." Jonas nodded, accepting both the compliment and the wisdom it carried. "Much obliged for your teaching," he replied. "We'll make it right." Clara watched them from the porch of the line shack, understanding that something important had shifted today. The carved stone had done more than prove their water rights. It had brought people together, awakening old memories of cooperation and shared purpose. The sound of the flowing water followed them all home through the gathering darkness. 2 days after the community work gathering, Clara swept the store's wooden porch as the morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street. The crunch of boots on frost made her look up. Deputy Wade Flanders approached, his badge catching the early light. Without a word, he tacked a notice to her door and turned away, his shoulders stiff. Clara's hands trembled as she read the official document. The railroad had conducted a revised collateral valuation of her property, triggering an early call on her IOU. What should have been months to pay now shortened to mere weeks. The choice was stark: pay in full or forfeit both ranch and store. The bell above the door chimed as Jonas entered, ducking his tall frame through the doorway. He found Clara at her desk, papers scattered before her. "They mean to take it all?" she said, her voice tight. "Everything Thomas and I built?" Jonas studied the notice, his dark eyes narrowing. "Might be worth checking the territorial filings. Sometimes paper tells tales that men won't." Clara nodded slowly. Deacon Cobb would know where to look. He kept records for years. They found Silas Cobb in his church garden, tending winter-hardy herbs. The old man's face fell as Clara explained their situation. He settled heavily onto a wooden bench, looking years older. "There's something you ought to know," he said, his voice rough with shame. "About 6 months back, Ephraim Cole came to see me. Made it clear things would go hard for the church if I didn't help him some." The deacon's hands twisted in his lap. "The acequia renewal papers, I filed them wrong, made them easy to lose." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. Without those papers, their water rights were vulnerable. But Cobb wasn't finished. There might be another way, though. The original treaty had a special clause about the boundary spring. If the community ditch is maintained with Apache consent, the spring access is shared by law. He looked up at them. "Nietzsche would know. His people have used that water since before any of us came here." Jonas nodded. "I'll ride out to speak with him." "I'm coming too," Clara said firmly. "It's my land at stake." By sunset, they had their answer. Nietzsche agreed to guide them to the spring the next morning, his knowledge of the old treaties matching Cobb's memory. Dawn broke cold and grey the following day. Clara mounted her bay mare while Jonas and Nietzsche sat their horses nearby. Snow flurries danced on the wind as they set out, following game trails into the hills. The going was slow. Patches of ice made the horses careful with their footing. Nietzsche led them along ancient paths, occasionally stopping to point out landmarks: a lightning-struck pine, a distinctive boulder, a row of stones placed by his ancestors to mark the way. "The spring has been shared water since the time of my grandfather's grandfather," he told them during a brief rest. The treaty only wrote down what was already true. By mid-afternoon, they reached a narrow valley. A small spring bubbled up from between rocks, its water flowing clear and strong. But crude wooden signs had been posted. "No trespass, railroad property." "Someone's been here recent," Jonas said quietly, pointing to fresh horse tracks in the patchy snow. As if summoned by his words, 3 riders appeared on the ridge above them. Clara recognized Ephraim Cole's silk vest and watch chain. His companions wore gun belts low on their hips. "This is private property," Cole called down, his horse picking its way toward them. "You're not welcome here." "The spring is shared water," Clara replied, her voice carrying in the cold air. "Protected by treaty." Cole's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "Treaties change, Mrs. Harrow. Progress doesn't wait for sentiment." "The law waits for no man's greed either," Jonas said quietly. One of Cole's men pulled his horse forward, hand dropping to his gun. "Watch your mouth, half-breed." The air grew thick with tension. Clara saw Jonas's hand drift toward his revolver, then deliberately fall away. He sat straight in his saddle, calm but alert. "We came in peace," Nigel said, his dignity a rebuke to their threats. "We leave in peace, but we will return with the law's weight behind us." Cole's face darkened. "The law backs the railroad, old man. Best remember that." "The law backs justice," Clara said. "Best remember that yourself." They turned their horses, riding away at an unhurried pace. Clara's heart hammered in her chest, but she kept her back straight. Behind them, Cole shouted something about consequences, but the wind carried his words away. When they were well clear of the spring, Jonas drew his horse alongside Clara's. "You showed courage back there?" "I showed sense," she replied. "You did too, not rising to their bait." "Violence feeds on itself," Nigel said from ahead of them. "Peace takes more strength." They rode on through the gathering dusk, the snow falling harder now. Clara's mind worked furiously, weighing options. The treaty clause was their best hope, if they could prove it still held force. But with the Asequia papers missing and Cole's men guarding the spring, the path ahead looked as uncertain as the snow-masked trail behind them. Yet something had shifted inside her. The sight of Jonas choosing peace over pride, of Nigel's quiet strength in the face of threats, gave her renewed purpose. This wasn't just about her property anymore. It was about right and wrong, about keeping faith with both the land and its people. The lights of Harrow's Crossing beckoned through the thickening snow as they descended from the hills. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight Clara took comfort in knowing they had found a way forward, if they were brave enough to take it. The night air bit cold as they made camp near the reservation line. Nigel's fire cast dancing shadows on canvas walls while snow settled softly outside. The smell of rabbit stew and pine smoke filled the tent, warming them after the long ride. Clara wrapped her hands around a tin cup of coffee, watching steam rise in the firelight. Jonas sat cross-legged nearby, his tall frame somehow fitting naturally in the close space. Nigel stirred the cooking pot with practiced motions, adding pinches of dried herbs. "The water path is old as the mountains," Nigel said, his voice carrying the weight of generations. "My grandfather's grandfather knew it. The people always shared with those who respected the land." He ladled stew into wooden bowls, passing them around. "When your husband came, Mrs. Harrow, he understood this. He asked permission before cutting the first ditch timber." Clara's throat tightened at the mention of Thomas. He believed in doing things right. "The old ones marked the spring path with stone circles," Nigel continued. "Some still stand. Tomorrow I can show where they were, prove the water's shared history." Jonas spoke quietly. "The syndicate won't care about stone circles." "No," Nigel agreed, "but the law might, if enough people remember." They ate in companionable silence, the stew rich with wild onions and high country herbs. Later, wrapped in wool blankets, Clara lay awake listening to the wind. Through the tent walls, she heard Jonas and Nigel speaking softly in Apache, their words like music in the darkness. Morning brought clear skies and fresh determination. They rode back to town, arriving as church bells called people to Sunday service. Clara's mind was already forming a plan. After the sermon, she stood before the congregation. Sunlight streamed through plain glass windows as she spread out their evidence on a wooden table. The stone rubbing from the Asequia, Nigel's carefully drawn map of the spring path, and her own property documents. "This isn't just about my land," she said, her voice steady. "It's about all our water rights, about keeping faith with treaties and neighbors alike." Jonas rose from his place at the back. He stood straight and tall, meeting the townspeople's eyes. "Thomas Harrow saved my life 2 winters ago," he said. "Asked me to watch over his wife and land if anything happened to him. Yesterday, at the spring, I could have drawn against Cole's men. Chose peace instead. because that's what Harrow would have wanted. Solving things right, not just quick. Murmurs rippled through the church. Deacon Cobb cleared his throat. I might have some old ledgers in the church basement. Never threw anything away, truth be told. Give me 48 hours to search proper, and I will walk the spring path. Nitsch added, mark the old signs, write down the stories that prove shared use. Clara held her breath as the congregation considered. Finally, Mayor Webb stood up. I reckon we owe it to Thomas Harrow's memory to try things peaceful-like first. I propose a 48-hour truce. No moves against the spring or Clara's property while we gather proof. Heads nodded. The vote passed with raised hands and quiet ayes. Something tight in Clara's chest began to loosen. What happened next surprised her most. Women brought forward covered dishes, chicken pie, cornbread, apple cobbler. Men carried tables outside into the weak winter sun. Children ran playing between the adults' legs. Someone produced a fiddle. Mary Beth Quinn presented Clara with a patchwork quilt, sewn in secret by the Ladies' Aid Society. For when the nights get cold, she said, hugging Clara hard. As afternoon mellowed toward evening, Jonas sat with some of the younger children. In response to their shy questions, he sang a soft Apache lullaby his mother had taught him. The pure notes floated on the air, making conversations pause. Clara watched faces soften as they truly heard him for the first time. When darkness fell, the gathering slowly broke up. Clara drove her wagon home, the new quilt wrapped around her shoulders, feeling warmer than she had in months. Not just from the food and fellowship, but from hope, cautious yet real. From her porch, she watched Jonas ride toward the line shack, his figure clear against snow and stars. The full moon turned everything to silver. He sat easy in the saddle, like a man who had found his place at last. Inside, Clara added another log to the stove and opened her ledger. But instead of columns of numbers, she found herself writing about the day, the faces in the church, the shared meal, the sound of Jonas singing. Small moments that felt like the beginning of something healing in their torn community. Sleep came easier that night, with the quilt's weight comforting across her bed. The last thing she heard before drifting off was a lone coyote calling, not in hunger or threat, but simply announcing its presence under the bright winter moon. In his line shack, Jonas banked the fire and stretched out on his narrow cot. For the first time in years, he felt no need to sleep with one eye open. The town's acceptance might be new and fragile, but it was real. He touched the medicine pouch at his neck, his mother's last gift, and whispered a prayer of thanks in 2 languages before sleep took him. Morning light filtered through frosted windows as Deacon Cobb pulled another dusty box from beneath his desk. Papers scattered across the floor of his cramped office, property notices, church records, and faded territorial documents. His weathered hands sorted carefully through the yellowed pages, searching for anything that might help Clara's cause. Must be here somewhere, he muttered, adjusting his spectacles. Ancient receipt books and missionary logs joined the growing pile. Each new box yielded fragments, a water rights petition here, a boundary survey there, but nothing showing the complete Acequia history they needed. By midday, the winter sun hung pale in a steel-gray sky. At the Harrow homestead, Jonas worked steadily, pitching fresh hay into the barn. The familiar rhythm of physical labor helped ease his mind, though his thoughts kept returning to the burned bridges upstream and the syndicate's threats. Clara stood behind her store counter, carefully arranging new inventory, threads, coffee beans, lamp oil. The bell above the door chimed as Mrs. Quinn entered, stamping snow from her boots. Mighty peculiar weather brewing, she said, eyeing the darkening sky. Winds picking up something fierce. As if in answer, a powerful gust rattled the shop windows. Clara looked up sharply at the sound of wood groaning. Outside, loose shutters banged against the clapboard walls. Jonas noticed it too. The barn's roof timbers creaked ominously overhead as the wind rose. Setting down his pitchfork, he quickly saddled his horse and rode toward town. The temperature was dropping fast, and the air held the sharp promise of snow. He found Clara in the store, helping Mrs. Quinn wrap purchases in brown paper. Barn roof's starting to lift," he reported quietly. "Might need extra hands to secure it before the storm hits proper." Before Clara could respond, shouts erupted from down the street. "Fire! Fire at the church office!" They rushed outside. Orange flames already licked the windows of Deacon Cobb's small office. Smoke billowed black against the grey sky as townsfolk streamed toward the blaze. "The ledgers!" Clara's voice cracked with despair. Jonas sprinted to help form a bucket line from the town well. Men passed water hand to hand, while women evacuated nearby buildings. Deputy Flanders directed the effort, his badge glinting in the firelight. But the dry winter wood caught like tinder. Despite their desperate work, the office burned hot and fast. When the flames finally died, only charred ruins remained. Clara stood motionless, watching thin wisps of smoke curl up from the ashes of their evidence. "Well, well," Ephraim Cole's smooth voice cut through the crowd's murmurs. "Quite convenient, isn't it? All those troublesome records gone just like that." He produced a scorched kerosene can from the debris, holding it up for all to see. "And look here, initials scratched on the bottom. J.J.G. Jonas Greywolf, if I'm not mistaken." The crowd shifted uneasily. Jonas stood very still, his face impassive. "Now hold on," Clara started, but Cole spoke over her. "Deputy Flanders, I believe this calls for immediate action. Can't have dangerous men running loose, destroying property." Flanders looked torn, glancing between Jonas and Cole. "No proof it was him," he said slowly. "No proof?" Cole's laugh held no humor. "His initials on the murder weapon aren't proof enough? What about maintaining order, Deputy?" More townspeople gathered, drawn by the commotion. The wind whipped their coats and skirts, carrying the acid smell of smoke. Finally, Flanders squared his shoulders. "Jonas Greywolf," he announced formally. "I'm taking you into custody. For order's sake, until this gets sorted proper." "You can't!" Clara stepped forward, but Jonas caught her arm gently. "It's all right, Mrs. Harrow," he said quietly. "Sometimes a man has to bend like a reed in the storm. Less chance of breaking that way." He held out his wrists to Flanders, who looked almost apologetic as he snapped on the handcuffs. The small crowd parted as the deputy led Jonas toward the jail. Cole smiled thinly at Clara. "Such a shame about your hired man. But then, what else could you expect from his kind?" She met his gaze steadily. "I expect the truth will come out, Mr. Cole. It has a way of doing that." The storm broke as darkness fell. Clara pulled her coat tight against the driving snow and began the long walk home. Grief and fury warred in her chest with each step. The wind howled around her like a living thing, drowning out her thoughts. In the jail's single cell, Jonas sat on the narrow cot, his back straight against the cold wall. The small window rattled in its frame as the storm raged outside. His voice was barely a whisper as he hummed the familiar words. "I'll keep the wolves far while your coffee stays hot." A promise made to a dying friend. A promise he intended to keep, bars or no bars. Through the swirling snow, a coyote's lonely call echoed across the darkened town. The storm settled in for the night. While inside the jail, Jonas continued his quiet song. The storm grew fiercer through the night. Wind screamed down from the mountains, rattling windows and tearing at loose shingles. By 3 a.m, the temperature plummeted further, turning rain to stinging sleet that coated everything in treacherous ice. Up in the hills, the hastily built berm groaned under the increasing water pressure. Frozen ground couldn't absorb the surge, and the crude earthwork began to crack. Shortly before dawn, it gave way with a thunderous crash, releasing a wall of muddy water down toward Harrow's Crossing. Clara slept fitfully in her bed above the store, worry for Jonas mixing with concern about the storm. A frantic pounding at her door jolted her awake. "Clara! Clara Bell Harrow!" Phoebe Lark's voice carried even over the howling wind. Clara hurried downstairs in her nightgown and shawl, fumbling with the lock. Phoebe burst in, snow coating her shoulders, her usually neat grey hair wild around her face. Your store roof! Phoebe gasped. The main beam's starting to go. Sheriff sent me to warn you. Water's coming down Main Street, something awful. Clara grabbed her coat and boots. Outside, icy slush swirled knee-deep through the street. In the pre-dawn gloom, she could see the store's roof sagging dangerously in the middle. The weight of ice and snow threatened to cave in the entire structure. We need to brace it, Clara said, wading toward the storage shed. Her hands shook with cold as she dragged out a ladder. Help me set this up, Phoebe. You can't go up there in this weather, Phoebe protested, but she helped steady the ladder anyway. Clara had just started her climb when a cry for help cut through the storm. Through the swirling snow, she made out old Mr. Peterson, clinging to a hitching post as the flood waters tugged at his legs. The current was getting stronger by the minute. She hesitated, 1 foot on the ladder rung. The store roof creaked ominously above her. Everything she owned was in that building, her livelihood, her independence, her memories of Harrow. But Mr. Peterson's voice held raw fear. Go, Phoebe urged softly. The roof can wait. Clara splashed through the deepening water toward the stranded man. Hold on, Mr. Peterson. I'm coming. His wrinkled face was grey with cold. Can't feel my feet anymore, he stammered as Clara reached him. Put your arm around my shoulders, she instructed. We'll take it slow and steady. Together they struggled through the flood, Clara half carrying the elderly man as ice-laden water swirled around them. Behind them came an enormous crack, the store's roof beam finally giving way. Clara didn't look back, focusing on getting Mr. Peterson to safety. The church stood on slightly higher ground. Light blazed from its windows as they approached, and several men rushed out to help them up the steps. Inside, dozens of townspeople huddled on the pews, wrapped in quilts and sharing cups of hot coffee. Get him close to the stove, Clara directed, her teeth chattering. He needs warming up right away. As willing hands helped Mr. Peterson, Clara sank onto a bench, exhaustion hitting her like a physical blow. Her clothes were soaked through, her fingers numb. Someone draped a blanket around her shoulders. Phoebe returned from checking on other neighbors. Your store, Phoebe began gently. Clara nodded, fighting back tears. I know, but Mr. Peterson's alive. That matters more than timber and tin. Throughout the day, more people sought refuge in the church as the floodwaters slowly receded. Women organized food and dry clothing. Children huddled together, wide-eyed at the storm's fury. Men ventured out in groups to check on livestock and buildings. By evening, Clara sat near the pot-bellied stove, cradling a tin cup of coffee in her thawed hands. Her store's roof had partially collapsed, soaking inventory and threatening the building's structure. The material loss was staggering, but watching her neighbors help each other, sharing blankets, comforting frightened children, offering what little they had, she felt a deeper kind of wealth. In the jail cell, Jonas listened as the storm's roar gradually faded to whistling gusts, then to occasional sighs. His worry for Clara never ceased, but something in his heart told him she was safe. He hummed their shared promise once more, his deep voice barely above a whisper in the gathering darkness. I'll keep the wolves far while your coffee stays hot. The words carried a new weight now. He might be behind bars, but that promise still held true. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Outside, the last of the floodwaters drained away, leaving behind mud, debris, and, though they didn't know it yet, evidence that would change everything. Morning broke over Harrow's Crossing with startling clarity. The storm had swept away every cloud, leaving behind a crystalline sky and bitter cold that turned puddles to glass. Icicles hung like daggers from every eave, catching the pale sunlight. Inside the church, families who'd lost homes or rooms to flooding huddled on pews, sharing what blankets remained dry. The pot-bellied stove radiated welcome warmth as women took turns making coffee and heating pots of beans. Children slept curled together like puppies, while their parents spoke in hushed voices about repairs and losses. Phoebe Lark moved quietly through the shelter, gathering hymn books that had been scattered during the night's chaos. Her grey hair was neat again, tied back in its usual bun, though worry lines creased her forehead as she straightened the sanctuary. These books were old friends to her. She'd been caring for them for 20 years, ever since her husband passed. As she lifted Deacon Cobb's favorite hymnal from its usual spot in the third pew, a single yellowed page fluttered to the floor. Phoebe bent to retrieve it, her eyes widening as she recognized the careful handwriting. It wasn't a hymn at all, but a territorial ledger page, an Asequia assessment from 3 years prior, signed by both Silas Cobb and Naichi Yazi. Her hands trembled slightly as she read. The document detailed water usage rights and maintenance responsibilities, proving the ditch had been actively managed well after the railroad arrived. This was exactly what they needed, proof of continuous use. "Clara!" Phoebe called out, her voice carrying across the church. "Clarabelle, come quick!" Clara looked up from where she'd been helping serve breakfast to displaced families. She hurried over, dark circles under her eyes, testament to her sleepless night. "What is it, Phoebe?" "Look what I found in Silas's hymnal." Phoebe handed over the document with reverence. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, doesn't he?" Clara's fingers traced the signatures, hope dawning in her tired face. "This is it," she whispered. "This proves the Asequia rights were maintained. We need to tell Jonas." She wrapped her shawl tightly against the cold and hurried through the frozen streets toward the jail. The morning sun cast long shadows across the mud-caked thoroughfare, glinting off broken windows and collapsed awnings. But Clara barely noticed the damage, clutching the precious document to her chest. Deputy Flanders sat at his desk when she entered, looking as weary as everyone else in town. He'd been up all night, too, keeping watch over both his prisoner and the struggling community. "Deputy," Clara said firmly, "I need to speak with Jonas. We've found something important." Flanders gestured toward the cells without rising. His usual rigid posture was absent this morning, replaced by something that looked almost like defeat. Clara approached the bars where Jonas sat on his narrow cot, still humming that familiar tune. "Jonas," she called softly. His dark eyes met hers, warm despite their surroundings. She held up the ledger page. Phoebe found proof. The Asequia assessment from 3 years ago, signed by both Cobb and Naiche. It shows continuous use and shared management. Jonas stood, moving closer to examine the document through the bars. "That's what we needed," he said quietly. "But the ditch needs clearing after the flood, or it won't matter what paper says." Clara turned back to Flanders. "Deputy, we need Jonas's help. The spring line hearing is in 3 days. If we don't get that ditch flowing proper by then, this proof won't mean anything." Flanders remained silent for a long moment, staring at his hands folded on the desk. Finally he spoke, his voice rougher than usual. "Had me a brother once. Tommy. Worked railroad crew out of Kansas City." He paused, swallowing hard. "Fight broke out over pay. Tommy tried to break it up. Got himself killed for his trouble." He looked up, meeting Clara's questioning gaze. "Been hiding behind this badge ever since, telling myself I was keeping order. Maybe I've been keeping the wrong kind of order." "It's not too late to choose different," Clara said gently. Flanders stood, keys jingling in his hand. "1 hour," he said, "under guard, with the town watching." "That's all I can give you." "That's all we need," Jonas replied, standing straight as Flanders unlocked the cell door. Word spread quickly through the shelter. People emerged from the church, gathering in the muddy street despite the cold. They watched in silence as Jonas walked between Clara and Deputy Flanders, heading toward the damaged section of ditch. The flood had torn away parts of the bank, filling the channel with debris. Jonas studied the destruction, then began giving quiet instructions. Men stepped forward with shovels and picks. Women formed lines to pass rocks and branches. Even children helped, carrying small stones to shore up the walls. Under Jonas's guidance, they worked together, ranchers, storekeepers, displaced families. The sun climbed higher, melting surface ice and making the labor easier. Through it all, Deputy Flanders stood watch, his hand never far from his gun, but his eyes showing growing respect for the communal effort before him. As the promised hour drew to a close, water began flowing properly through the cleared section. The sound of it running clean and strong brought smiles to tired faces. This was how the acequia was meant to work, maintained by many hands, serving all. "Time's up," Flanders announced reluctantly. Jonas nodded, handing his shovel to a nearby worker. He turned to Clara, speaking low. "The ditch will hold now. You've got your proof and your water flow for the hearing." "We'll set this right," she promised, as Flanders led Jonas back toward the jail. The gathered townspeople watched them go, their silence now thoughtful rather than suspicious. Clara clutched the precious ledger page, her heart full of equal measures of hope and determination. The storm had brought destruction, but it had also washed away some of the barriers between neighbors. As she watched the restored water flow, she heard Jonas's hummed promise echoing in her mind, a reminder that some things were worth fighting for. The afternoon sun hung low over Main Street, casting long shadows across the mud-streaked buildings. Townsfolk gathered in clumps along the boardwalks, their breath visible in the cold air. Children perched on wagon beds for a better view, while their mothers pulled shawls tight against the bitter wind. The sound of hoofbeats drew everyone's attention. Naiche Yazi approached from the east, leading a small group of tribal elders on horseback. Their faces were solemn but dignified as they dismounted near the church steps. Clara stood waiting with Deacon Cobb, the precious ledger page protected in her hand. "Neighbors," Cobb called out, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "We're here to set things right." His hands shook slightly as he unfolded the water-stained document. "This assessment, dated 3 years past, bears witness to our shared stewardship of the acequia." He read slowly, each word clear and measured. "We, the undersigned, do hereby confirm the continuous maintenance and shared use of the Boundary Spring Ditch System, as established by territorial law and Apache custom." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "Signed by myself, Silas Cobb, and Naiche Yazi, representing both town and tribe." Clara stepped forward, holding up the stone rubbing she'd made of the carved initials. "This marking proves the ditch's age," she said. "It shows how long we've worked together to make the water flow fair." Naiche moved to stand beside her, his silver hair catching the winter light. He spoke in measured tones, switching between Apache and English so all could understand. "Our grandfathers knew this spring," he said. "They taught us to share its blessing, to keep the water flowing for all who live here. This is not new law, it is old wisdom." Deputy Flanders emerged from the jail, leading Jonas Grey Wolf. The tall cowboy's wrists were still bound, but his head was held high. The deputy's keys jangled in the hushed street as he unlocked the cuffs. A commotion at the far end of the street drew attention. Ephraim Cole pushed through the crowd, waving papers. "This is all very touching," he sneered, "but I have railroad warrants here. Every piece of land from the spring to the station is subject to immediate seizure for track expansion." He thrust the documents at Flanders. "You're sworn to enforce the law, deputy. Clear these people out." Jonas moved deliberately, drawing his revolver. The crowd tensed, but instead of raising it, he walked to the church steps. With careful movements, he placed the weapon down. "If we keep the water flowing together," Jonas said, his quiet voice carrying in the stillness, "nobody needs to drown." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Phoebe Lark stepped forward, her grey head held high. "He's right," she declared. "We've lost enough to fighting." She looked around at the other women. "Remember when the fever came through? We didn't ask whose children were whose. We nursed them all." Martha Whitaker, who ran the boarding house, nodded firmly. "The acequia gate needs clearing. Who's with me?" One by one, the town's senior women moved forward. They gathered buckets and shovels, forming a line that stretched from the creek to the ditch head. Young mothers joined them, then their daughters. Men stepped in too, following the women's lead. Clara's heart swelled as she watched neighbors who'd been suspicious of each other just days ago, now working side by side. Naicha directed the crews with practiced knowledge, showing them how to angle the flow for maximum effect. The work was hard and messy. Mud splashed onto Sunday dresses and good boots, but no one complained. They passed buckets hand to hand, clearing debris and strengthening banks. Children darted between the workers, carrying messages and tools. Jonas moved through the crowd, his height and strength put to good use wherever needed. He worked without speaking, but his presence seemed to calm tempers and steady nerves. Ephraim Cole stood by the railroad office, his face darkening as he watched the community effort unfold. "This is illegal interference with railroad property," he shouted, but his voice held a note of desperation. The railroad boss's wagon sat at the edge of town, its occupant watching the scene unfold. The man's expression was unreadable, but he made no move to stop the work. A cheer went up as the first surge of water broke through the cleared gate. It rushed into the acequia, muddy at first, then running clearer. The sound of flowing water filled the street, strong and true for the first time in months. Clara stood at the ditch bank, watching the water find its proper course. Beside her, Jonas wiped mud from his hands. Their eyes met briefly, sharing a moment of quiet triumph. All around them, people were smiling despite their exhaustion, knowing they'd done something important together. Ephraim glared at the scene, his railroad warrants crumpled in his fist. But even he could see the tide had turned. When water flowed proper, life flowed proper. That was the way of things out here. The railroad boss's continued silence spoke volumes. The late afternoon sun gilded the water as it ran clean and strong through the heart of town. Children splashed at the edges while their elders nodded in satisfaction. The Boundary Springs blessing flowed freely again, bringing life to all it touched, just as it had in their grandfather's time. The winter sun climbed higher as Deputy Flanders strode to the center of Main Street, his badge catching the light. The ditch water gurgled beside him, a sound that seemed to wash away months of tension. He cleared his throat and pulled a worn law book from his coat. "By authority of territorial water law and standing treaties," he announced, voice carrying across the gathered crowd, "I hereby order the immediate dismantling of the illegal berm upstream." He turned to face Ephraim Cole directly. "Furthermore, Mr. Cole, you're hereby cited for destruction of public records and unlawful water diversion." Ephraim's face reddened. "You can't prove 3 witnesses saw you near Cobb's office before the fire." Flanders cut in. "And that kerosene can you planted?" "Store receipt shows Jonas was helping at the Miller farm when you bought it." The railroad boss stepped down from his wagon, boots squelching in the mud. He was a broad-shouldered man with steel-gray hair and practical eyes. "Cole," he said sharply, "you're relieved of your duties, effective immediate." He turned to address the crowd. "Folks, the railroad aims to be a good neighbor. I'm offering our crew to help restore the ditch system proper." Clara watched surprise ripple through the gathering. Naicha stepped forward, inclining his head respectfully. "Working together brings better results than working against each other," he said. "We accept your offer." Deacon Cobb pushed through the crowd, his eyes wet with tears. He stumbled to his knees in the mud before Clara and Jonas. "I'm sorry," he choked out. "So sorry for hiding those papers when Cole pressured me, for being weak when I should have stood strong." Jonas reached down, helping the older man to his feet. Clara touched Cobb's shoulder gently. "We all make mistakes, Deacon. It's how we make them right that matters." Phoebe Lark's voice rang out clear and strong. "I move we reinstate Deacon Cobb as keeper of the water records." She smiled warmly. "With Naicha Yazzie and myself as co-witnesses, to ensure nothing gets misfiled again." "All in favor," called Martha Whitaker. A chorus of "Aye!" echoed off the buildings. Cobb wiped his eyes with a trembling hand as Naicha and Phoebe stepped up beside him. The crowd began to disperse, people heading home to change out of mud-soaked clothes. The railroad boss conferred with Flanders about organizing work crews for the next day. Cole slunk away toward the station, his dreams of easy profit washing away with the flowing water. Clara gathered her shawl closer, suddenly aware of how tired she was. Jonas appeared at her elbow, quiet as always. "Might walk you home," he said softly, "if you've a mind." They walked together along the ditch bank, their boots leaving paired tracks in the mud. The water sang beside them, a sweet sound Clara hadn't realized she'd missed so deeply. Neither spoke for a long while, content to listen to the stream's music and the crunch of their steps. When they reached her homestead, the setting sun painted the water gold and pink. Jonas gestured toward his line shack. "Got coffee on," he said. "Could spare a cup if you'd like." Clara hesitated only a moment before nodding. The day's events had left her feeling both drained and oddly light, as if a great weight had lifted from her shoulders. They crossed to the shack, where Jonas had indeed kept the coffee hot. He poured 2 tin cups, and they settled on the rough bench outside. The ditch sparkled in the fading light, its sound a gentle backdrop to their shared silence. Clara wrapped her cold fingers around the warm cup, breathing in the familiar scent. "Reckon I could stay on," Jonas said finally, his deep voice careful and measured. "Past the contract time, that is. If you've need of a hand come spring." Clara sipped her coffee, watching the last rays of sun gild the water. So much had changed since that bitter night at the contract auction. The store would need repairs, the ditch would need tending, and there'd be new arrangements to work out with the railroad. But for the first time in months, she felt hope running as strong as the current beside them. "We'll see when spring comes," she said softly, allowing herself a small smile. "For now, this is enough." They sat together as evening settled over the land, 2 people who had found unexpected allies in each other, watching the water flow, true and strong, toward tomorrow. Spring crept into Harrow's Crossing like a shy fawn, tentative at first, then bolder with each passing day. The late March snow retreated into patches, revealing tender green shoots beneath. Along the acequia banks, last autumn's leaves gave way to fresh grass, and the water ran clear and strong, singing its age-old song through the valley. Clara stood in her store doorway, watching as Jonas and the railroad crew maneuvered fresh-cut timber onto the damaged roof. The morning sun caught in the sawdust that drifted down like golden snow. She could hear the steady rhythm of hammers and the occasional call for nails or measuring lines. Jonas moved with his usual quiet grace, despite the height, guiding each beam into place as if he'd been born to the task. His presence had become as familiar as the store itself over the winter months, solid and dependable. The thought brought a warmth to her chest that had nothing to do with the spring sunshine. "Looking mighty fine up there," Phoebe Lark called from the boardwalk, shading her eyes. "Never thought I'd see railroad men working so peaceful-like with our Jonas." Clara smiled at her friend's use of our. The town had slowly shifted its view of Jonas over the winter, especially after the flood. "Amazing what can happen when folks choose to work together instead of against each other," she said. By midday, the roof was nearly complete. The railroad foreman, Peterson, checked the final supports and declared it sound. "Better than before," he said, wiping his brow. "That timber's seasoned proper. Should last you 20 years or more, Mrs. Harrow." Jonas descended the ladder last, his shirt dark with honest work. He nodded to Clara as he passed, heading to the water barrel to wash up. She watched him go, remembering that first night when he'd stood shackled in the town hall. How different things were now. Later that afternoon, Clara gathered her ledgers and legal papers. It was time to settle accounts at the bank, a day she'd both dreaded and longed for through the long winter. Jonas appeared with the wagon, freshly cleaned and hitched. The ride to town was quiet, filled with the creak of leather and the steady clip of hooves. Clara held her papers close, years of careful bookkeeping and honest trade wrapped in brown paper and string. The air smelled of warm earth and promise. Inside the bank, Mr. Whitaker reviewed her accounts with professional efficiency. Clara laid out proof of the store's steady income, the restored water rights, and the railroad's formal acknowledgement of territorial claims. Her hands remained steady as she signed the final papers. "Well, Mrs. Harrow," Whitaker said, his usual stern expression softening, "your IOU is officially cleared." He handed her the deed to her property, the paper crisp and clean. "Your late husband would be proud of how you've managed things." Clara traced her fingers over the deed's embossed seal, emotion tightening her throat. Outside, she found Jonas waiting with the wagon, his face questioning. She nodded once, holding up the deed, and saw the quick flash of his rare smile. Instead of heading straight back to the store, they turned the wagon toward the boundary spring. The trail wound through greening hills, last year's grass giving way to new growth. They found Nietzsche already there, examining the spring's flow with careful eyes. "Welcome, friends," he said, rising smoothly despite his years. "The water runs strong and true, like good words between honest people." Clara dismounted, accepting Nietzsche's offered hand in greeting. "The ditch has served us all well this season," she said. "The ranchers are already preparing their fields for planting." Nietzsche gestured to the surrounding land, where wildflowers had begun to dot the grass. "When we work with the land instead of against it, everyone prospers. The shared labor has kept the peace better than any number of guns or laws." Jonas moved to stand beside them, his shadow long in the afternoon light. "The old ways still have much to teach us," he said quietly, "if we're willing to listen." They stayed a while longer, talking of spring planting and water management. Nietzsche shared stories of past seasons, wisdom wrapped in memory, while birds called from newly leafed branches above. When they finally took their leave, the sun was westering toward the mountains. Back at the homestead, Jonas disappeared into the line shack while Clara tended to the horses. When she finished, she found him carefully carving letters into the shack's wooden lintel. Stepping closer, she recognized the words taking shape beneath his knife. "I'll keep the wolves far while your coffee stays hot." Her breath caught. Harrow's promise, now etched permanent in wood and memory. Jonas worked steadily, each letter deep and sure, until the last curve was complete. He stepped back, running a hand over his work. "Seemed right," he said simply. "A reminder of good men and kept promises." Clara touched the carved words gently, feeling the roughness beneath her fingers. "Thank you," she whispered, meaning far more than just the carving. Evening settled soft around them as Clara prepared the shack for company. Jonas built up the fire while she set out plates and cups, the domestic routine comfortable between them. Soon, the sound of wagon wheels announced their guests' arrival. Phoebe arrived first, bearing a fresh-baked apple pie that filled the shack with sweetness. Deacon Cobb followed, clutching a bottle of blackberry wine he'd saved for special occasions. Nietzsche appeared last, carrying a clay pot of rich stew that had simmered all day. They gathered around the rough-hewn table, lamplight warm against the cool spring evening. The conversation flowed easy as water in the acequia, Phoebe sharing town news, Cobb describing the spring planting plans, Nietzsche telling stories that made even Jonas laugh. Clara looked around at these people who had become more than neighbors through the winter's trials. Phoebe's maternal warmth, Cobb's hard-won wisdom, Nietzsche's quiet strength. And Jonas who had brought change to her life like spring, bringing change to the land. The evening wrapped around them like a well-worn quilt, comfortable and warm. Outside, the acequia murmured its endless song, and new grass stretched toward tomorrow's sun. Clara felt something in her heart unfurling, like those green shoots, something that had lain dormant through the long winter, now reaching for the light. The church bell rang clear across Harrow's Crossing that Sunday morning, calling folks to gather for a special service. Sunlight spilled through the plain glass windows, catching dust motes that danced like tiny stars in the quiet sanctuary. The wooden pews, worn smooth by generations of worshippers, filled steadily as people arrived in their Sunday best. Clara stood near the back, arranging her fresh-baked pies on a long table alongside other offerings from the town's women. She'd risen before dawn to bake, wanting everything perfect for this day of blessing. The scent of apple and cinnamon mingled with the sharp spring air flowing through the open doors. Jonas moved through the crowd with careful grace, his dark suit brushed clean, helping elderly folks find seats. He guided Mrs. Peterson, the railroad foreman's mother, with gentle hands, making sure she had a clear view of the altar. His quiet strength seemed to put everyone at ease, even those who'd once viewed him with suspicion. "Here, let me help you with that, Miss Martha," he said, offering his arm to one of the town's oldest residents. The white-haired woman patted his hand in thanks as he settled her into a front pew. Outside, the acequia flowed strong and steady, its song carrying through the open windows. The water caught morning light, flashing like silver coins. Along its banks, fresh plantings showed green against the dark soil, proof of the community's shared labor and hope. Deacon Cobb stood at the front, his Bible worn and familiar in his hands. Beside him, 3 Apache elders waited with quiet dignity, their presence a bridge between peoples who'd found common ground in the flowing water. Nietzsche stood among them, his weathered face peaceful as he gazed out at the gathered congregation. "Friends and neighbors," Cobb began, his voice carrying to the rafters, "we gather today to bless this water that binds us together. Like the flow of grace itself, it knows no boundaries of race or creed. It nourishes all who treat it with respect and share in its bounty." Clara felt tears prick her eyes as the deacon spoke of unity and healing. She thought of the long winter, the struggles they'd faced, and how adversity had forged stronger bonds than anyone could have imagined. Jonas caught her eye from across the room and nodded slightly, understanding in his gaze. The eldest Apache leader stepped forward, speaking in his native tongue, while Nietzsche translated. "The water teaches us wisdom," he said, his words measured and clear. "It shows us how to flow around obstacles rather than break against them. It reminds us that all living things are connected, from the highest mountain spring to the lowest valley grass." The congregation listened intently, heads bowed in respect. Even the children sat still, sensing the importance of the moment. Through the windows, Clara could see the ditch gleaming in the morning sun, a silver thread stitching their community together. Deputy Flanders stood at the back, his badge catching the light. He'd removed his hat, holding it respectfully against his chest. When the prayers ended, he made his way to where Clara stood. "Mrs. Harrow," he said, his usual stern expression softened with something like humility. "I wanted to thank you proper, for seeing past my hardness this winter. Losing my brother to railroad trouble, it made me build walls I shouldn't have." Clara extended her hand, meeting his eyes. "We all carry burdens, Deputy. The blessing comes in learning to set them down." They shook hands firmly, the gesture witnessed by several townspeople who nodded in approval. The deputy's shoulders seemed to relax, as if laying down a weight he'd carried too long. After the service, the congregation spilled out into the bright spring morning. Tables were set up along the ditch bank, laden with food that spoke of celebration. Clara's pies, fresh bread, roasted meats, and dishes that reflected both Apache and settler traditions. Children, finally released from the church's solemnity, raced along the ditch bank with joyful shouts. Their parents called half-hearted warnings as small boots splashed in the cold water, sending sparkles into the air. The sound of their laughter mixed with the water's song, a melody of pure happiness. "Careful there, young ones," Jonas called as several children ran past. They waved to him, their faces bright with excitement. Clara watched as he smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious features. The feast lasted well into the afternoon. People moved between groups, sharing food and stories, the old divisions fading like winter frost in spring sunshine. Nietzsche sat with Deacon Cobb, their heads bent together as they discussed plans for maintaining the ditch through summer. The railroad foreman joined them, offering crews to help with the heavier work. As the sun began its westward slide, folks gradually headed home, carrying empty dishes and full hearts. Clara and Jonas walked slowly back toward her homestead, taking the path that ran alongside the acequia. The water moved beside them, steady and sure, while meadowlarks called from fence posts. I was thinking about Harrow today, Clara said softly, breaking their comfortable silence. About how he always saw the best in people, even when they couldn't see it themselves. Jonas nodded, his steps matching hers. He had a way of making folks live up to what he saw in them. When he found me in that blizzard, he didn't just save my life. He gave me a purpose. They paused at a bend in the path, watching the water flow past. The late afternoon light turned it to liquid gold, beautiful and alive. You know, Clara said, I haven't felt the wolves near in months. She looked up at Jonas, seeing how the sun caught the silver threads in his dark hair. Not since you came. Jonas turned to face her, his eyes warm with understanding. We'll keep the wolves far, he said quietly, while our coffee stays hot. The simple change of word, from your to our, hung in the air between them, full of meaning. Clara felt something shift in her heart, like ice breaking up in spring, letting new life through. They stood together as the sun painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, watching the blessed water flow past. All around them, the land was waking to new growth, new possibilities. The work of their hands and hearts had bound them all together, stronger than any contract or deed. The acequia murmured its ancient song, carrying the day's blessings downstream to nourish the waiting fields. Tomorrow would bring more work, more challenges to face together. But for now, in the gentle evening light, they had this moment of peace, of promise kept and community restored. In the distance, the church bell rang once more, soft and clear in the gathering dusk. The sound rippled out across the valley like the water itself, touching all it passed with grace. The summer morning dawned bright and clear over Harrow's crossing. Clara stood on the line shack's wooden stoop, coffee pot warm in her hands. The rich aroma mingled with fresh-cut hay and wildflowers as she poured 2 steaming cups. Beside the shack, Jonas ran a whetstone along his tools with steady, practiced strokes, the sharp ring of metal marking each pass. Down by the acequia, neighbors arrived carrying buckets of green cuttings and saplings. Their cheerful voices carried on the warm breeze as they gathered along the banks. Phoebe Lark spread colorful quilts in the shade, creating comfortable spaces for the older folks to rest and visit. Naicha moved among the children, his weathered hands gentle as he showed them how to plant young trees. Like this, he demonstrated, positioning a sapling. The leaves will grow to shade the water, keeping it cool and clean. The children listened intently, eager to help with such important work. The church bell rang out across the valley, its clear tone floating over the fields where wheat swayed golden in the morning light. Jonas set aside his tools and joined Clara on the stoop, accepting the coffee she offered. His eyes crinkled at the corners as he smiled. We'll keep the wolves far while your coffee stays hot, he said softly, the familiar words carrying new warmth. Clara leaned against his shoulder, feeling the strength and steadiness there. The acequia flowed past, its waters catching sunlight like scattered diamonds. Along its banks, many hands worked together, planting, tending, building a future as intertwined as the roots that would grow deep beside the flowing water. Faith and trust settled over Harrow's crossing like a gentle rain, nourishing something as precious as any crop, the peace they had all worked so hard to grow. Thanks for being here. If this story stirred something in you, a memory, a feeling, a truth, go ahead and subscribe. I'll be back tomorrow with another moment that just might speak to your soul.